The combination of digital pathology and AI has the potential to help realize the vision of precision medicine. Today's guest, David West, studied computational biology at Johns Hopkins before co-founding Proscia, raising more than $80 million, signing up big labs and most of the big pharma companies, and being named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. So, what is digital pathology? Why does it matter? And what does the future hold? Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the Health Biz Podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. If you like the show, please subscribe and leave a review. David, welcome to the Health Biz Podcast.
David, thanks so much for having me. I'm pumped to be on.
Sounds good. The 30 under 30 is tough. They never talk about the 10 under 10 under the 5 under 5.
No, they don't. I wouldn't have made the list.
Okay,
I was there at the perfect time. It's my peak of my career.
That sounds perfect. Well, let's talk about those early days then, even if you didn't quite excel until a little bit later on. What was your childhood like, and any childhood influences that have stuck with you?
Yeah, I've always been an entrepreneurial kid. I've always been a nerd and love technology. My parents are both engineers and worked in tech. I spent a couple years of my life living in the Bay Area during kind of peak tech boom in the 90s before kind of coming back home to Philadelphia, where I grew up and where I live right now. So I grew up around people that were building things, that were, family friends that were working at Livermore National Laboratories or like starting companies. And that was always kind of part of my life. My first little business was, I was always starting things, but I guess the first thing where I made a tiny bit of money was I started this little company called tape2disc.net when I was in like 6th or 7th grade. And basically people would send us these VHS tapes that we would convert into, when I say I would convert into DVDs. And sometimes they were wedding videos, which was really, scary. So I got my first taste of, both handling sensitive data and converting from an old data format to a new digital data format. Though I think we expanded our market to like one little corner of Havertown, Pennsylvania.
Nice.
But that's kind of was always in my DNA. I was always the dorky kid who loved technology and loved building things and kind of had an entrepreneurial bone. My mom is also a cancer survivor, and I saw her go through that at what was for me a pretty young age, as well as for her in the grand scheme of things. And obviously a really, really impactful thing for her, for the family. And fortunately for her, it was really good outcomes, though we've had family and friends with not so good outcomes. And I think that's always kind of left a lasting impression on me. And so when I was, by the time I was, kind of coming into the real world, I went to school for biomedical engineering and with a focus on computational biology, like you mentioned, at Johns Hopkins. And when I started kind of, getting into ultimately what would become Proscia, into this field, I think those were kind of, my guiding passions. I was really passionate about technology and building things and starting things, and really, really passionate about working on big problems like cancer.
And did you sort of know computational biology was what you wanted to do? It's not something that's always obvious, even out in the in the Bay Area to people. Maybe they had a course on that at Palo Alto High or wherever you went to school. But
no, I mean, look, I always loved software.
Yeah.
And I loved computers. But I think I loved everything. I I think for me, it was kind of not able to pick a subject. And I decided when I went to school, going into biomedical engineering and computational biology was like, wow, we get to do physics stuff and biology stuff and computer science stuff. And, you know, jack of all trades, master of none, in a sense. But for me, that was perfect because I'm just insanely curious and have some level of ADD, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're going to need that as an entrepreneur. So let's talk about the origin of Proscia. How did the idea come about? Was there some unmet need that you said, "Hey, we got to go after this," and you've got the right skill for it?
Yeah. So when I was at Johns Hopkins, I you know found some amazing mentors, really just kind of knocking on doors of folks whose research I thought was interesting at Hopkins Medicine, where there were these amazing scientists and medical doctors who were working on cutting edge technologies in healthcare. Um, and breakthroughs in science broadly. And I had the chance to meet and work with two people, a guy named Don Coffey, who's no longer with us, who is the head of the Brady Urological Institute at Johns Hopkins and the Cancer Center. He's the deputy director at the time. Amazing guy, total legend there. Had been like an advisor to U.S. presidents on cancer, and just the perfect person you could have as someone who's young and passionate, in introducing me to the right people and thinking about some big problems. And then he introduced me to a guy who was his colleague, um, Bob Veltri, who was working on this amazing technology using computer vision and machine learning to predict cancer outcomes from these images of biopsies. And so, what a pathologist looks at on a microscope, kind of like if you can see the 1937 Olympus behind me.
Yeah, a little bit.
Um,
Yeah, there we go.
they're looking at this little piece of tissue on a piece of glass, this tiny thing that's like smaller than your pinky. When digitized, there's a gigabyte or a billion pixels of data that has incredibly rich information about the tissue, the disease, the underlying biology, perhaps the tumor, if that's present. And so he was building these models that would predict, in his case, prostate cancer outcome. They were looking at biochemical recurrence and Gleason scoring prediction, using the image data. And so I kind of started scratching my head and saying, well, gee, why is there this amazing technology in an academic setting? People working with like Python and MATLAB and 200 slide kind of frankly toy data sets,
Yeah,
um, that can be amazing kind of research. We get a great paper out of this, but then you go into a real laboratory and it's like Victorian era technology, right? This technology was not making its way into real laboratory settings, um, and that's when I really got excited, and also I guess to a certain extent frustrated. Um, I was excited because there's this huge amount of data that's being created when all of these images, which there's roughly a billion slides, physical glass slides created for diagnostic purposes alone every single year, that were all going digital. Like this trend
yeah,
was taking, labs were starting to adopt these scanners and it had already been adopted for research use pretty well at the time. Um, so excitement about that, but also frustration that the technology that was being used, especially the software that was being used, was basically like the best thing we had was this kind of crappy desktop image viewer that came with the scanner.
yeah,
And so it's like you buy your scanner and you get this little like piece of software that you have to, put on a CD-ROM and like put on this server, and you can only view images from that scanner. If you want to do any work with it, you got to export it and like put it on some other hard drive and write a Python script and do some analysis. It was like there's clearly not at all the infrastructure that would allow this stuff to scale. And the images were huge. And so they really were challenging to deal with. I think that was a big thing that we heard from pathologists and scientists that maybe wanted to work with this data in theory. It's like, hey, these are gigabyte sized images. It's super expensive for me to store. It's a whole IT job just to manage all of
yeah.
that data and to work with that data. I don't know if I, it's is it worth all, is the juice worth the squeeze? And so we started building this really simple kind of, software foundation with the premise that, hey, we can take, we'll build this as a cloud-based system. So we called it Pathology Cloud. And it was sort of like Google Drive for pathologists. We made it really easy for images from any scanner to get into this platform, and built it on a modern tech stack where scientists and pathologists uh, could analyze these images, where algorithms could be developed using this data and then deployed right into that environment where you could view results, power the workflows, etc. Um, and so those were kind of like the early beginnings of our company, and we put it out there for free. It kind of took off. A couple hundred scientists and pathologists started using it, mostly people in my sort of world,
Yeah,
people at academic centers, a couple people we were collaborating with at Case Western and Vanderbilt and MD Anderson. And that allowed us and allowed me to kind of turn this into my full-time job and start a real company behind it.
that's cool. It sounds like I was asking you about your youth before. It actually sounds like the first part of this business was kind of like the tape to DVD. Taking something off of
Totally.
a.
Yeah. Yeah. I should tell that story more often. I sometimes forget about that, but it is, I guess for whatever reason, I've had a passion in bringing old information mediums into new information mediums.
I should dig out some of my old videos here of my kids when they were little. As some of those have to be
Yeah,
digital. Some of those are on like digital, supposedly digital tape, but that's kind of almost a
yeah,
oxymoron. But we'll see. Maybe after the podcast we can catch up on that one. So pathology is obviously it's kind of like a weird branch of medicine. No one
yeah,
no one think I'm going to go see the pathologist today.
yeah.
Usually don't want to don't want to
No,
do that. And it was one of the last ones to digitize, I think. Even when you had the electronic medical record, and it's partly because of these huge files that you're talking about. Has that digitization allowed pathology to really advance, or you were kind of coming up against, hey, they got all this stuff digitized, but the impact is quite limited because of how where
yeah.
they had stopped.
It's funny. You talk about seeing the pathologist. There's this. I have this story. One of our investors who invested in our Series B was doing diligence on the company, and after they decided to invest in the company, we said, "Yeah, we want to work together with you." He showed me this text that he had sent to a friend of his in medicine. And he said, "Hey, do you have any pathologists that I could speak with?"
Yeah.
And the guy called him right away. "Hey, what's wrong? Like, is everything
Yeah.
okay?" Right? Like, yeah, getting talking to someone and say, "Hey, I want to talk to a pathologist and maybe get an opinion on my report or my case," is not always a great thing for a patient. Pathologists play a huge role in the healthcare system, and they're often kind of overlooked because they're sitting in a laboratory, and the interaction that most people have with a pathologist is, getting some physical piece of paper or a PDF report that's like, a little blob of text, with some pathologist's opinion that they
Yeah.
dictated into their microphone at one point. And maybe it's your oncologist or your gastroenterologist or your dermatologist who's telling you what the pathologist said. So often forgotten about, but they touch almost every single serious decision in healthcare, influencing, the question of, do we have cancer or some other disease? How bad is it? What sort of treatment options do we have? And they're really quarterbacking a lot of the important information required to make big decisions for a patient behind the scenes. They're running tests. They're deciding which tests to run, recommending certain tests, maybe even recommending certain therapies to the oncologist or whoever. Um, and yes, they've kind of been underserved by technology for such a long time. Radiology went digital literally decades before
Yeah.
pathology. 20 years ago, and today, pathology is still in the process of going digital because the images are huge, it's costly, um, and frankly, the regulatory barriers are still, um, I say that the regulatory barriers are still present, but are kind of coming down. when I first got into this space, there were no scanners that were approved by the FDA for
Yeah.
diagnostic use. So it was relegated to a research technology. You could not adopt this until basically 5 years ago. And ever since then, the first scanner got approved in 2017. More scanners have gotten approved, more continue to get approved. The scanners have gotten faster, cheaper, higher quality. They're not just research tools anymore. They're fit for real diagnostic purposes. And this whole ecosystem of technology has been built around that. There's also been this sort of snowball effect where as more pathology labs go digital, companies like us can go have a new market that we can sell to, attract investor capital, build new technology in this, which is accelerating adoption even more. I think we're still in the very early days of this adoption where most laboratories in the US and Europe and globally are adopting digital pathology for diagnostic purposes for the first time. Some of the biggest laboratories in the world have done this. They've leaned into it. They kind of have the economies of scale to justify the costs. And they've created the blueprint for these other laboratories to go digital themselves. And the use cases that these labs are adopting this for is to kind of distribute their pathologist workforce, centralize their slide prep maybe at one or two locations where the physical slides get prepared and scanned, and then basically farmed out to these teams of pathologists wherever they might sit. Um, and we're also starting to see some of these laboratories put in AI applications into those workflows.
Great. Well, let's talk about that in a minute. You mentioned, and it was talking about how you don't go to see your pathologist. I'm actually one of the few that does because as a bald redhead, I go to the dermatologist, and
There you go.
they don't get taken seriously because looking for skin cancer. So I have an MD, PhD, derm path who I actually go to, which I recommend for people like me. So
Brilliant. I tell people the same thing. Like you might want to talk to a pathologist, and
yeah,
a big challenge here is especially for um, challenging diagnostic cases like melanoma, for example, very
yeah,
challenging, very high discordance rate. So you might get an opinion from pathologist one that's very different than pathologist two.
yeah.
And that's a huge challenge, especially when most people just get whatever pathologist happens to live in their town or be within
Right.
their hospital system, rather than the best pathologist in the world for their case. And maybe that's an MD, PhD pathologist who specializes in whatever, in melanoma and Barrett's
Yeah.
esophagus, or right. There's
So
ideally the best pathologist for your case is the one who's reading it.
so the digital side of that, of course, allows that sort of distribution. Now, I mentioned dermatology, you mentioned oncology,
Yeah.
gastroenterology. Are those the three main specialties, or what specialties do you see digital pathology impacting the most?
Yeah, that's look, pathology touches basically any tissue-based disease as well as other parts of the laboratory touching maybe doing blood-based testing. They talk about um, in sort of the most stark terms, there's like the meat lab and the juice lab. A lot of
Yeah,
what we deal with is the meat lab, right? Any sort of disease that's tissue-based, solid tumors, skin, etc. You're getting going to a gastroenterologist, you're getting a biopsy, that's going down to a pathologist, and it's getting put on a glass slide. Um, the high volume subspecialties within pathology are, number one is derm, right? Everyone goes to the dermatologist. Some people more than others. Really relatively easy to get a biopsy. It's not
yeah,
as complicated as other procedures. Then you've got your gastroenterology, super high volume, lots of screening for colon cancer, for upper GI conditions. I found myself at a pretty young age getting scoped down in an upper GI procedure, getting a biopsy. That was my first personal experience with that.
nice.
So it's the types of things you know where you would expect there to be a lot of volume. You also see a lot of prostate and breast. Those are some of the key
Yeah.
areas. But again, pathology touches pretty much every part of medicine.
So for ProShow, what? So we talked about disease segments. What about on the customer side? Who is actually a buyer for what
Yeah.
you're offering?
We found our early traction. I think, like a lot of companies in healthcare medicine in general, found our early traction selling a research use only product to a research customer base. And at first, we had a couple of academic centers that were using our software, which is now called Concentriq today. And they've been amazing customers who have places like Johns Hopkins that actually publish rare and challenging cases as part of their surgical pathology unknowns database, and that's an amazing asset for the world of pathology. People outside of that community started catching on and seeing, hey, what is the software that some of these top academic centers are using? Can I use that?
Mhm.
One of our one of, we got a early on in our company journey, we had a pharma customer company call us, very top five pharma company, high profile pharma company, and one of the teams there based on the West Coast said, hey, we see this product that folks at Hopkins and Vanderbilt are using, and what does it cost, and can we get
Yeah.
our hands on that? And we pretty quickly realized, oh, there's like big budgets
Yeah.
in pharma,
Exactly. That's
and
where
there's
you
a
want to.
real problem.
That's where you want to put the phone on hold for a minute before you just tell them whatever you charged, Vanderbilt. Give them that
Yeah,
price.
as naive entrepreneurs, I wish we put a zero on the other side of what we told them. Eventually, we figured that out. But we got a lot of our early traction with academic centers and then pharma.
Yeah.
Today, we've got 14 of the top 20 pharma companies using our platform, as well as increasingly large contract research organizations. About half of research is outsourced. Half of pharma R&D work is outsourced, like something like that. And so those contract research organizations play a huge role in tissue-based research and development, whether that's doing biomarker work or toxicopathology studies. And the great thing is that there's not all the same regulatory barriers to get into that market. So we built a lot of early momentum in this market where those same barriers didn't exist, but where we could mature the technology. Um, and then, over time, as the diagnostics market has grown, we've had the capital and the traction to invest in the regulatory capabilities that would allow us to break into that new market. And that's kind of been our second success.
Got it. Okay. So you've got, one way or another, a sort of a research market on the academic side and then on the pharma side. And then if I think about clinical practice, just going back
Yeah.
to my example with CMI, Durham Path, what is going on with pathology in terms of reimbursement? Again, it's not a doctor
Yeah.
you typically see, and the workflow is pretty different. And what have been the kind of typical reimbursement approaches, and how has that helped or hindered progress in pathology?
Yeah, the general reimbursement landscape for pathology, like much of many other corners of healthcare, has had a lot of downward pressure on it. There's a few kind of billing codes that are bread and butter reimbursements for a laboratory. So, like, there's 188,305, which is basically your routine review of a H&E or hematoxylin and eosin stained image. It's this one, right? It's the
Yeah.
sort of pink and purple one that you see, um, and that's like a huge portion of like what a laboratory is doing. They're getting a biopsy. They're doing a sort of visual review of that from a pathologist. And there's two parts that they get paid for. They get paid to prepare the slide, and they get paid to read the slide, the technical component and the professional component. The technical component in particular has gotten a lot of downward pressure on it, and the professional component has some downward pressure, but more or less stayed flat, certainly not keeping up
Yeah.
with inflation. And what that's meant is that it's forced laboratories to figure out how to do more with less, which I guess is kind of what, the goal of what CMS is trying to
Yeah.
do. I get it. It's been painful for some of these laboratories, but I do think that it's put a big emphasis on technology adoption for these laboratories, who have to figure out, hey, I can't just hire many, many more pathologists to handle this. I need to make sure that I'm being really intelligent with how we take this on.
Now, you had started to talk before about AI, and I said I would come
Yeah,
back to that. What is the role of AI in pathology, and how does it relate perhaps even to, this need to do more with less?
yeah. AI has already had a huge impact in research use cases for tissue imaging and pathology. And we've seen our life sciences customers in pharma and academic medicine really lean into the adoption of AI, starting with earlier AI technologies. You're kind of, um, you know, at this point, there's some more old school technologies in computer vision and machine
Yeah.
learning. Even today's approaches are starting to make you know technology from just 2 years ago look outdated. Um, and they've continued to lean into that, right? I mean, we're seeing serious step function improvements in the capabilities of AI. I think a lot of the average people got a taste of what's happening
Yeah.
and the pace of innovation when ChatGPT hit the scene. Those types of technologies, LLMs and image based, um, sort of cousins of that technology, have made a really big difference, both in terms of kind of the efficiency of R&D and our ability uh, to understand disease on a deeper level. So a lot of the early work that's happened, or I should say, the most exciting work that's happening, been in novel biomarker discovery and development and companion diagnostic development, which is especially important in um, the age of precision medicine, where we're not taking these kind of blunt force approaches to therapies that you'd have with chemotherapy. We sometimes have precision therapies that are perfect for one type of patient. We just have to know what's the right criteria to getting that patient on that therapy, and that the information exists in the tissue. It's literally a picture of the disease or a picture of the tumor. And so there's been a lot of amazing work that those life sciences organizations have been doing to leverage that data and leverage modern AI technologies to understand disease and developing new diagnostics. On the diagnostic side, we're starting to see serious adoption of AI for a lot of the low hanging fruit use cases. And that starts with, hey, is this a high quality image, or are
Yeah.
there artifacts that could disrupt the workflow or make the pathologist spend too much time on a case they don't need to? That happens all the time, right? Data quality is really important. Slide quality is really important. There might be folds, blurs, other issues that happen with that slide. To workflow, kind of diagnostic workflow use cases like tumor detection in prostate cancer or breast cancer, where the pathologist is tasked with, um, reading a very kind of large geography of tissue in which tumor might be present in a small portion of that. You're looking for a needle in the haystack. AI is really good at telling the pathologist, why don't you focus over here? Or
Yeah.
maybe this slide out of the 30 slides created for this one patient is the one that you should start with. And that's adding a lot of efficiencies to these laboratories. And some of the early studies that have happened in real world settings over the last year. But going forward, we're seeing more technology being developed that might be coming out of pharma or coming out of academic spaces or coming out of innovative companies that might predict disease outcome or disease progression or recommend therapies based on that tissue. And that's the advanced stuff that I think I get really excited about, and a lot of the market gets really excited about.
So you've, started to build this company, taken in a lot of capitals, a lot of promise, got good traction. As we look ahead, what would you say your main goals are for this year of 2024, and then maybe over the 5-year time horizon?
Yeah. This year it's really simple. I think the market is still in its, first or second inning, and our job is just to get our technology into the hands of as many people as possible. It's basically, get off of VHS and into the digital world. In this case, get off of the glass slide and microscope and into the image-based discipline. We also want to bring more AI applications into our ecosystem. We built some, our partners built some, and our customers built some too. 70% of our pharma customers use our API to develop their own AI applications. And we think that's a kind of supercharger for our community and ultimately for our business, when we can enable people to develop more applications. But it's really simple. We want to get more customers on our platform, and we want to help them shift towards a data driven discipline. Over the next 5 years, I think there's a lot of exciting um, opportunities for us and our community especially at the intersection of the kind of life sciences side of things and the provider side of this ecosystem. I think that's an often overlooked opportunity in this space. A lot of the amazing kind of data and insights that are coming out of the diagnostic setting can be super powerful for, say, finding the right patient to enroll in a clinical trial or developing a novel biomarker. Um, we also think that we can create that sort of pipeline for life sciences organizations to deploy novel therapies and diagnostics into our network of lab partners for the provider side of the ecosystem. So there's kind of this two-way street where, um, you know, each side of our ecosystem, we hope, can partner with each other to deliver more value to patients and capture more value from this incredible data that's kind of coming online that would otherwise be on a shelf on a piece of glass collecting dust and not doing anything for us.
Well, it sounds good, and I appreciate the 5-year vision, because if they have a 35 under 35 list, I'll be able to see if you still merit
Yeah,
inclusion.
exactly. Yeah.
So I want to ask you a final question, which is about whether you've had a chance to read any good books lately, and if there's anything you would recommend for our audience or recommend that they avoid.
Okay, I do. I'm reading one right now that is an incredible book. I'm a history buff. Like, I spend a lot of my time reading history stuff and biographies. The book I'm reading right now I think it's called The Fish That Ate the Whale. The Fish That Ate the Whale. It's about this guy whose name I might mispronounce, but it's like Sam Zamora,
Uh-huh.
born in like 1890. And he got in on the ground floor of the banana trade, taking these bananas that were considered too ripe by like the large companies that we now know as like Dole.
Yeah.
Um, and selling them on trains and basically getting them to customers faster than these big kind of fruit conglomerates were able to. And he ends up building this empire and ends up kind of taking over the big giant companies himself. It's this crazy, awesome book about hungry, scrappy immigrant entrepreneur in the United States who makes something out of nothing but a little bit of hustle and a lot of passion.
No, that sounds like a very good one. I've heard of it. I haven't read it yet, but I'll have to put it up on my list
It's
to
a
do.
great read.
Good. Well, David West, co-founder and CEO of Proscia, thank you so much for joining me today on the Health Biz Podcast.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.